What kind of a marriage do you think that Scott and LACI had?
They had a very good marriage. They backed each other up all the way. It was like it was them, and we were all outsiders. They were totally dedicated to each other.
They were totally dedicated to each other. Well, what did Scott do on Christmas Eve, on this day that he was so dedicated to her?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, as promised, an analysis of the relationship between Jackie and LACI. It's interesting to me that Jackie fleshes out the marriage of her son and LACI by adding, quite unnecessarily, it was them and we were all outsiders. It's interesting because it sort of feels like that's what the Peterson clan looked like and felt like, in a way, to LACI, and certainly in terms of this investigation as well. The Netflix docuseries and one of LACI's close friends said that LACI sometimes felt that she was an outsider.
LACI did touch on the Peterson dynamic a few times and always mentioned that it became a lot.
And the reason it became a lot was because it was such a big family, and sometimes big families are hard to sort of become part of that tribe when the tribe is so big and sort of overwhelming, especially if you're from a small tribe.
I think she would get a little overwhelmed when everybody got together.
It's also a very interesting choice of words that Jackie uses when she says they were totally dedicated to each other, because that is how I think Jackie felt about Scott. She was totally dedicated to him. He was her golden boy.
I don't know, I always felt like Scott was the golden child because he was the only one between them and he could do no wrong between
Outsiders. They were totally dedicated to each other.
And I must say, I just love the look on Barbara Walters' face after Jackie comes out with that whopper. They were totally dedicated to each other, were they? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'll be doing a live stream later today in about 2 hours from now. 2 hours after you watch this, it'll probably be around about that time. I'll put a link to the live stream in the description. Please also joining the Patreon of this channel. It's at patreon.com/TCRS, and we have daily updates. There are 22 audiobooks on the channel and also weekly chapters uploaded. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. Oh, and don't miss the number 2 clue we all missed, which is the next episode in the series. And let's get started. So Jackie says, in response to what kind of a marriage did Scott and LACI have? Well, that they were totally dedicated to each other. Then you have this bewildered look, to put it mildly, on Barbara Walters' face. And then she basically questions them with a bit of critical thinking.
Did you have any idea that your son was seeing another woman?
No.
Barbara Walters' follow-up question to what kind of marriage did Scott and LACI have was to ask whether Scott's parents knew about his affair with Amber. And not to state the obvious, but if Scott was cheating on LACI, well, then they weren't totally dedicated to each other. So why say that on national television? I mean, at the time that they were asked this, they knew this. So why say it? Next, Barbara Walters asks,
So when you heard that he was seeing another woman, what did you think?
It was surprising. It was disappointing, but it's certainly not anything that's extraordinary.
Scott's father, Lee, seems to kind of shrug, and what he's literally doing is he's shrugging it off, and he's saying, yeah, he was surprised to hear about the affair, and so Barbara has to set him right again.
Well, if you thought the marriage was so good, were you not shocked?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were shocked.
But then after saying they were shocked, Lee rationalizes Scott's affair as being reasonable and not that surprising all over again. And so Barbara's got to get him back on track a third time.
Quality of life. Men have affairs. Women have affairs.
When their wives are 8.5 months pregnant?
Probably
That's
more
mostly
so.
when men do, we've learned.
And the most telling answer is that both Lee and Jackie said the most common time for men to have affairs are when their wives are pregnant. Well, then the answer is you weren't shocked and you weren't surprised. And so why this nonsense that they were dedicated to one another and backing one another up to begin with? It just seems a bit of a slippery way of answering those questions. The fact that Scott went fishing on Christmas Eve and basically sketches himself as being out by himself all day in bad weather while his pregnant wife is home over Christmas, it really does drive it home that even besides the affair, Scott wasn't dedicated to LACI. But is there something deeper going on there? On Netflix, it's clear just how resolute the support still is from Scott's family, especially from his two sisters, one of which seems to have made it her life's work to get him out of prison and exonerated.
It was like it was them, and we were all outsiders.
The reality is, I don't think one is going to get a fair or true or really insightful or meaningful peek into the real Scott from his family, because we are all the outsiders, which is why I think the insight we get from someone who was sort of half in, half out is so meaningful. Who am I talking about? Anne Bird, Scott's adopted half-sister. Anne Bird wrote a book providing 33 reasons why she felt her brother was guilty of murder, but more pertinently, she shared her own first-hand experiences of what she thought Jackie, her adopted mother, really thought about LACI. On page 177 of Bird's book, Blood Brother, she lists 33 points for why she thinks Scott is guilty. Have a look at item 23. Jackie had told her on 3 separate occasions that Scott and LACI were having problems. On page 171, Bird provides her own reaction to Jackie's appearance on Barbara Walters. She notes that what Jackie told Barbara Walters and what Jackie had told her weren't the same. On page 172, Bird describes Jackie painting an exaggerated portrait of a trouble-free marriage. I do think both Jackie and Scott were exaggerators. When you hear about the way Scott would woo his girlfriends, including LACI, driving around in a convertible, taking her to holidays in Mexico. He also went to a lot of trouble to seduce Amber. You can read that in her book as well. You can see that Scott was a real exaggerator, and that's using a kind word. Interestingly, Jackie also said that Scott got his nature from his mother. All of this is still fairly non-specific though, and often when it comes to family dynamics, this kind of thing is very private, very hard to discover. It's the kind of thing that outsiders are going to struggle to get this kind of intimate knowledge. But Bird provides some specificity when describing LACI's baby shower, and I do think it's interesting that LACI's mother wasn't present and that there were essentially 2 baby showers, one for the Petersons and one for LACI's family. One can also not help wondering, did Sharon and Jackie get along very well? In any event, Bird also describes Jackie at LACI's baby shower as a bit of a nag. For example, Jackie complained to Anne Bird that LACI's thank you card was too formal to buy the book, and that she intended to give LACI a book on how to write thank you cards. Pretty incredible, isn't it? Scott also seemed to be aware of the enmity between Jackie and LACI, at least according to Bird's version of events. When it was mentioned, all of this that was taking place, Scott exhaled loudly saying, "Yeah, those 2. Jackie also didn't seem to approve of LACI's outfit during a particular trip and didn't like Logan, one of LACI's early ideas for naming their son. You might say, there are a lot of mother-in-laws that don't like this and don't like that. Doesn't mean there's anything more to it than that. Except if you can remember these instances, there probably were a lot more that have sort of slipped your mind. Bird says that Jackie told her in a mean tone, told LACI that she didn't like the name Logan. None of this is obviously a smoking gun. None of it is hard evidence, but one can't help thinking if Jackie did disapprove of LACI, if she felt LACI wasn't good enough for Scott, her golden boy, in some way, if she generally didn't like LACI or didn't get along with her, then probably Scott was aware of it too. What I'm trying to say is we may not be 100% sure of that side of the equation, but if that side of the equation was what we are thinking it could have been, then that plays into, it makes sense in terms of the criminal psychology. Because if Scott was aware of it, it may have played into his criminal psychology in two potential ways. If LACI disappeared, he probably felt he could rely on his parents' ongoing support, which, let's face it, he could and he did. And then the second one, if Jackie didn't like LACI, there may have been a part of her that may even have approved of LACI disappearing, perhaps in a subconscious sense, but in a sense even blaming LACI, or otherwise rationalizing or understanding why she disappeared. And I must say, in the interview with Barbara Walters, it does seem like there's explicit rationalizing going on. One can't help seeing a parallel here between Scott and Jackie and Chris Watts and his mother, Cindy Watts. We know that Watts' parents didn't even attend their son's wedding, and we know just a few days before the triple murder, Shanann had been so upset with Cindy, her mother-in-law, for having nuts in her home. And one of her kids was allergic to nuts. I think it was in the ice cream. Shanann said that the kids would never see their grandparents, Watts' folks, ever again. Now, in a sense, this was quite useful to Chris Watts, who was having an affair at the time. And again, if Shanann and the kids disappeared, Watts probably felt he could rely on his parents' ongoing support, which, let's face it, he could and did. His father was even present kind of at the interrogation, holding his shoulder. If Cindy didn't like Shanann, there may have been a part of her that may have even approved of Shanann disappearing, in a sense blaming Shanann or otherwise rationalizing or understanding why she disappeared. So you've got a kind of dynamic that seems to be a match across these two totally different cases. You have an intertextual family dynamic. Certainly appears that way. But what seems to be left out of all of this is the tremendous betrayal to be cheating on your wife while she's heavily pregnant. Scott did it, and Chris Watts did it, and that taboo is almost as bad as the next one, committing murder at this time where it's supposed to be about love and trust and respect and a long-term commitment. But the one, I think, flowed into the other. The one betrayal, which is bad enough, flowed into the other betrayal, which was also extremely bad. And I think there was a sense from both men that they were justified in doing what they did, perhaps not explicitly, but perhaps tacitly, perhaps subconsciously, perhaps because of how their own mothers thought and spoke about their wives. In this sense, one could even say the spark for the criminal psychology that killed these women may have started, in a certain sense, with a disapproving mother-in-law and allowed to fester. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that? Obviously, whatever the answer is, at the end of the day, it was these men that killed their wives, these women, both of them pregnant. I'm not going to take it further than that. Don't forget the live in a couple of hours on this channel. We'll be briefly discussing the rival documentaries going on right now in the Scott Peterson case, and then also don't miss the next episode in the series where we'll look at the number 2 clue we've all missed. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.